Welcome all to PCSBV's first fall speaker series. This follows on the tail of a couple of years worth of this endeavor for the Palliative Care Society of the Bow Valley. And we're happy to pick things up again for our academic calendar moving forward. And we're launching the next part of our speaker series with two fantastic speakers, and I'll get to those in a minute. But just before that, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge where the Palliative Care Society of the Bow Valley resides. And that is in this very sacred space between these mountain ranges that cradle us. And we are situated on Treaty 7 territory. So that's the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. And also all of the other creatures that inhabit this space with us, not just the human inhabitants, but those others that make this place their home. With that, I want to just let you know, by way of heads up, that the conversation that's going to be coming forth might activate in you certain kinds of emotional responses. So if you feel unsafe in this conversation, or if you just acknowledge within yourself that there's a lot of emotional energy being stirred up and you want to follow up with that, there's several possibilities. If you need to step out of the conversation, of course, you please take good care of yourself. If you would like to follow up with me, you can reach me at bill.harder@pcsbv.ca. And maybe Catherine, you could put that in the chat for us. And so that's my email address for work, or my phone number for work, which is 403-458-0433, and you can text or phone me on that number if you need to debrief something you've heard today. So please just do take good personal care of you in the next hour. And it's my great joy and privilege to introduce these conversationalists this afternoon. The first I know barely, to be honest, that's Anna Harder. I have spent close to 30 years trying to mine knowledge of this individual, and I must say I barely have scratched the surface. Nonetheless, born and raised in Alberta and spent almost all her life in this province, with the exception of a time when her husband dragged her off to grad school in Saskatoon. A person who I would say first and foremost is a lover of the land and an amazing artist, and I don't want to use the word amateur, that would maybe degrade it, but a great herbologist in her own right. She's done a bunch of professional things, really huge resume of professional stuff, but it's not nearly as interesting really as the language she speaks with trees and creatures, and the naming of the things in her life, and an incredibly brilliant mind. On the other side of the conversation, whom I also don't, I really barely know either of these people, to be frank, but I was graced with getting to meet Richard last year, and Anna and I are in the Valley as a consequence of Richard's random email to us saying, hey, do you think you'd be interested in this? I think a lover of humans, as I've heard his story, an explorer of the human experience, a wonderfully soft heart and a sharp mind, and somebody who has gone across our planet and received the gift of being mentored and providing mentorship on many levels. And again, it's not his professional background that is intriguing in this conversation. It's this heart and soul of a lover of people and a caregiver that is brought forth. And so Anna Harder, diagnosed 1 year ago with metastatic carcinoma, and Richard Lesueur, whose family member was diagnosed, I think it is, he'll tell the story, but about 7 years ago, with a catastrophic cancer diagnosis. So with that, I would just like to open up the story to unfold between the two of them. And I'm not sure if they did paper, scissors, rock to decide who initiates this conversation. It's just a living room conversation, quite frankly. And we've invited you into our mutual living rooms. So I'm going to turn it over to Richard and Anna at this point.
All right. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Anna. I think you're starting. Am I right?
Well, I think I am. It's sort of, you know,
decided that.
Yeah, it's nice to get together to visit with all of the voyeuristic peeps around. It's kind of weird and fun, and I'm looking forward to it. So when we had, just a heads up to everyone watching, this is very unrehearsed. It is like a conversation in the living room, but we did map out a couple of things, and I want to start out with a very basic factual timeline, just to like bring people who are unaware of the past year of my life just sort of up to speed on the facts. And from there, we'll move into some of the more other aspects of what life is like, other than just reading a medical chart with facts. So I'm going to go fairly quickly, and just going to start. So very point-like bullet points are in the air as I speak. October 2019, having a shower, literally find like a quail-sized egg lump in my right armpit. By November 2019, still not gone, but I'm not really the paranoid type, but go to the doctor. So follow with mammogram, ultrasound, and shunted over to a surgeon who my doctor thought would just like pop that out. It's just an overactive lymph gland. And that was the diagnosis at the time, confirmed also by the ultrasound radiologist. June 2020, my doctor's reading through old files. COVID's happening now. He says, "Do you still have that lump?" Because he just phones me. And I go, yeah. And he goes, "Oh, well, you better get another ultrasound. We want to make sure it's not changing." It's like, okay, go, another ultrasound. Don't hear anything. October 2020, doc is checking through his files again, still COVID, right? And he says, "You need a biopsy. This isn't going away. I don't know why no one phoned you back in June. It isn't bigger, but it's bothering me." And so followed by a week later, first diagnosis, stage 3 metastatic carcinoma. This is breast cancer, even though all the mammograms, and I think there were 3 that year, showed nothing. The ultrasound said it was nothing. And all of a sudden, boom. So that's literally the stage is set, and there were lots and lots of appointments, but I'll just leave it. That's sort of just the basic first chunk of the timeline. And yeah.
Yeah, so Anna, as we were speaking the other day, and you wanted to lay out the sort of facts of the story. I mean, the aim of this conversation, as it's been defined, is to really talk about the reactions and responses that arise within us and at the time of the diagnosis. And maybe you could just give us a bit more detail, sort of reel it back into that moment. Sure. And say some things, please.
Okay. It was so multi-layered. I mean, literally when the nurse called me after the biopsy of the little quail egg, and she said, "Your doctor needs to see you this afternoon." Already, you know, no one said anything, right? You just know. So there's this like lead lump in your stomach, and you sitting in the waiting room, and you get into the doctor right away, and you've not even made an appointment, and thinking, this never happens. The doctor has a student working with him that day. this young woman, and she's almost in tears before she gets in the room. And I'm already going, what? And my doctor sits down, doesn't really look at me, is looking at all of these results that he's reading, and shaking his head. I've never seen anything like it. And this lead lump that's in my stomach is like starting to churn now. It's weird, and it's trying to keep my body and my mind sort of in one place together. And when he said, you have metastatic carcinoma, this is a breast cancer that's moved, and you just think, I feel like I'm in a movie. I'm not really here right now. Yeah, lifted outside of that. Our culture is so sensitive to the word cancer, and thinking that that's your potential death sentence, that it was like a surrealistic moment. I didn't feel like crying or even being my usual smart ass self. I just like sort of was just stunned, I think, in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes I come across the term emotional flooding. And it's a good term, because it's when people say, I'm just in a fog, I don't know how to respond to a situation, because it's just so overwhelming at the time.
Yeah, that's a great term, emotional flooding. Yeah, so flooded you don't know what emotion to express, or yes, they were all there. So the whole process, like over those initial days and weeks, it was so turbulent, because the diagnosis kept moving and changing, as well as my responses to it. So it's not like they said, whoops, we made a mistake. That wasn't really your file. I kept waiting for that to happen, but it didn't. But the diagnosis went from pretty bad to what at the time we felt was even worse, because originally the surgeon who they sent me to said, okay, bedside manner was maybe not his forte, but it's like, get your affairs in order. You aren't going to have most of this next year of your life in any way that you could imagine it, because there will be surgery, there will be full-on chemotherapy, there will be radiation. You will not be able to function in the way that you're accustomed. So literally get your affairs in order. So I was in my head, I'm like, I used to tell my accounting clients that, but I didn't mean it in quite the same way. And that was when we had to take, like Bill and I had to take the lid off the can and let people know, because I thought I was involved in the boards of 4 different organizations, from which I'd just been told I wouldn't be able to function in any useful way, and that I would therefore need to resign from. And that meant the community was going to find out in little ways. So everyone needed to find out, so they didn't hear it through some back door. So those next weeks were probably the hardest of the entire last year. It was the telling other people and the emotional flooding that they felt, that they experienced. Because it's a flood, it washed over us too, right? So you start to think you're getting a grip on your own emotions, but you're holding those of everyone else.
This is so profound. You're inviting us into your story, Anna, in this way. And I should probably say to the group that's listening in, I mean, even as you do this, Anna, I realize it's shorthand of an enormous experience that you're providing for us in this conversation. What I bring to this conversation, remembering that the focus is on the early reactions and responses to receiving a cancer diagnosis, is the experience of being a companion with others like Anna and with their family members. this is an intimate conversation, and I want to be careful and respectful of the vulnerability that you are inviting us into in your own story. It's really so generous of you to do this for us. It's a very different kind of noontime conversation. So let me offer something that I think I have found to be true of human experience. And that is that, and then invite your response to this, is that our psyche protects us, prevents us from experiencing the full weight of a traumatic event, and only gives us as much as we're able to manage, whether that's a grief or a loss, a tragedy, a life-limiting diagnosis, because we cannot bear it all at once. And that this is part of our defense mechanism, it's part of our self-protection. And of course, there's been a lot of research on how the brain responds to traumatic experience. And so while I've recognized this in people in my practice, dealing with sudden loss, but I also know it in myself. So I'll just give you one simple illustration. It's not an easy illustration. A number of years ago, I was living in Jerusalem at a time of conflict, and I experienced on a street a sudden uproar and calamity, and as can happen. And in this instance, a man was thrown to the ground, unarmed and swarmed by soldiers, beaten in front of me, shouting cries. It's madness. He grabbed the end of a rifle butt to stop being struck by it. He wouldn't let go, and then he was shot right in front of me. And it just tore into my whole being. And actually, as I say this already, anyone listening to this is already experiencing secondary trauma. As your mind swells with questions and images and repulsion and reaction to the story, which is part of what happens, of course, when a loved one first hears that their loved one has received a diagnosis of cancer. There's a secondary trauma because both your lives have been changed. But anyway, in that instance, for me, there was an immediate physiological set of indicators of that impalement, of that experience in my own life. And even though I carried on with my teaching work and being a father to my sons and so on, I knew that an enormous part of that experience was being held back and restrained in some way by my psyche. And it would be months, it was months and years, to sift the emotions of that event. So we can speak of protective mechanisms that step in at a time of trauma. And yes, there's denial, which is another form of coping, but denial may not be a particularly helpful form of coping if we avoid the realities of our lives chronically. But I have seen in this with others, this protective sieve that only permits so much to be released and processed at any given time, just so we don't fall apart. And I wonder, Anna, you know, in the experience of your receiving that life-limiting diagnosis and as it progressed, and you talked about those opening weeks and months, how does this seem true for you?
Yeah, sieve, that's right. Like some little bits are blocked up, but some of it's coming through. I do believe it was a bit like that, but part of like I want, and I should have said this earlier, my experience, I don't intend for this talk today to be prescriptive of anyone else's experience. This is my story, how I related to this news. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's just the way it is for me. And the progression of my disease isn't a result of anything that I've done or not done. That also just is. So I don't have any, I'm not saying, hey, you get cancer, you call Anna Harder, she knows how to fix you up. This is just my story in this time. And I know that others have different stories, and many of them are in many ways much more challenging than my last year has been. But the sieve, like the parts you can handle at once. If we go back to that beginning time, there was just, Bill and I, we couldn't really talk. We talk about it, but then we'd have to not talk about it. like just put it away and revert to our regular routines as much as we could. We weren't neither of us, and it's not fair for me to speak for him, but I certainly speak for myself. We weren't sleeping well. I likened it in a way to when COVID first happened in March of 2020. And I felt this like constant weight of this anxiety that followed not just me. I think the whole country and the whole world was experiencing that, waiting for something big or bad to happen. I mean, obviously something big and bad did happen, but we were waiting for it to affect us personally in some horrendous way. And I had that same feeling in those initial weeks and months because I'd just been told I had cancer and I was going to die. Literally, they told me that. But why didn't I feel differently? So I'm carrying around this angst, waiting for this bad thing to happen, like the Grim Reaper standing behind me with his scythe. But I would turn around and there wasn't anybody there. So it just took a while for that hindbrain, that physiological response of this constant vigilance, like exhausting me, keeping me awake. The first thing you think of when you wake up in the morning, oh yeah, you're dying. That you can't get these thoughts out of your head when you go to sleep at night. Oh, like, what can I do for the kids? And this is so hard for them. And it was just over and over and over. But eventually while the sieve was wide open on those parts at that time, eventually that just sort of slowed down to a bare trickle, because partly I think physiologically one's adrenal glands can't keep up that kind of vigilance. And partly because you just start in your head to believe that, oh, the Grim Reaper might be back there, but I think I need my binoculars. I don't think he's that close.
Which is wonderful. I mean, that's something I think I mentioned just briefly yesterday, that one of the ways that I view this, and this is just my cognitive overthink, and we're talking about emotional things, I realize, but I tend to see that there's a kind of polarity that can set up, and this helps me in my practice, that for the individual, there is, first of all, a diagnosis of cancer is devastating to the core. It's our worst fear, everyone's worst fear. It's not far down the road of life or adolescence or childhood where we learn that cancer is a robber and tears people away from their families, their loved ones, tears them away from their dreams, their hopes, their life expectation, and so on, and comes out of the dark and just snatches people with no rhyme or reason. That's the enormous tragedy and the fear that's attached to us, out of which we all respond when we hear the name, just even hear the word cancer. Yeah. And yes, we can counter that by saying, well, there's people who go through treatment and then they go on and they live normal lives for decades and they're cancer survivors, which is the kind of antidote statement that gets added in sometimes to close down the side of the polarity that is so painful and hard, because that's an abyss. And we can drop into that abyss and talk about that cauldron where there is fear and loss and anxiety and grief and anger and etc. Yeah. But the foundational claim, and I think this is what you're saying, that begins to rise out of a situation, if not right away, is I'm alive today, which is our innate will to live. You once said, when we were talking about titles for this session today, I still buy green bananas, which I love, because so I see this polarity, and I'm inviting your response to, on the one hand, there's the devastation that's there, but there's also, I'm still alive today. Yeah. And there's a tension between those two realities, and we live somewhere on that continuum on any given day or at any given moment, and also depending upon who we're with. For example, we just saw on the CBC that Premier Horrigan in British Columbia has just been diagnosed with cancer. And his statement was, the prognosis is good and I expect a full recovery. well, that's, I'm going to live, right? I'm still premier. I can handle this. We're going to be fine.
Yeah.
And that's good and important. Alex Trebek did the same thing on Jeopardy, because I think it was Roland Rollheiser said years ago that we are built for the stars, meaning that there's a drive within all of us towards limitless life. I mean, who wants to think about mortality? Who does? We tend to live our life as if we're living forever, that there is no end. And when that drive to live mingles with the diagnosis of a life-limiting illness, it can spit back that wonderful determination that says, you know what? I'm going to survive this. I'm going to fight this. I'm not going to give up. We can beat this. I'll go through the treatments, but I'm not going to let it ruin everything right now. So anyway, I'm just sort of playing with or suggesting because, and I'll say in a moment, how that polarity helps me to understand my own practice, but I'm just wondering what that sounds like to you.
I resonate with some of those thoughts, Richard. Something near the end of that, though, brings me back to a conversation that was early days conversation between Bill and myself, in that I've never been comfortable, and it's just, again, this is just me, with using words like the fight, the battle, the winning, the losing, that they seem so combative. And even, I don't like to watch action movies. I don't want to watch and be watch a thriller where there's all this tension. I like my murder mysteries, but it's because they're cerebral. They're not like angst driven. So I didn't want to say, I'm going to win this fight. I'm going to fight this. I'm going to get rid of it. As that initial burden of like great angst and anxiety wore down, and I tried to be with who I was with this new knowledge and this new insight, because really nothing had changed for me. I thought, okay, who am I now? Am I different than I was before? I need to accept that this cancer, this thing, is part of my physicality. What does it have to teach me? Is there anything it can teach me? Can I learn to be calm in this? It's undoubtedly my lack thereof that may have contributed to this diagnosis in the first place. So I couldn't handle the idea of like all these like battle things. Even my grandson wrote me a card saying, "You're going to win this fight, Gran." And I'm like, I accepted that from him in the spirit it was intended. But for me, it's not a fight. It's let's, learn to go along and get along. We're going to come out of this together in some way. And you're right. There's the yes, you're going to die, and we all cognitively know that, but we seldom give it a thought until someone puts it on your more imminent horizon. That, oh yeah, we just moved the gateposts up a little bit closer, and now this is what you're looking at first when you open your eyes in the morning. They're not so far away anymore, and it started to feel okay, but it was probably 2 or 3 months on before I could say that it was no longer this huge drama in both my physiology and in my brain.
You know what I love about what you just said, which I think highlights a truth in this, is that there's a degree of it's really quite a solo journey that occurs from the moment of a life-limiting diagnosis. It's deeply personal, but at a foundational level, it's solo. That doesn't mean that there aren't others who are important and valuable and necessary, but it's intensely my journey. I'll choose the language by which I live this and the themes by which I will construct and understand this new experience in my life, because it's my life. It's the ending period of my life, however long I have, and I will define it. And that's my decision on what terms I do this.
Yeah.
And there's a loveliness about that too. I mean, it sharpens, I imagine, I think, how we go about our living with a greater attentiveness.
It's really done that for me. I mean, the title of the talk was To Live Like You're Dying, which is, blatantly stolen from the country music song by Tim McGraw. And no, I'm not doing 8-second rides on mechanical bulls. But I literally every day I go, hey, you feel good. What are you going to do? And it has been a great blessing. I have never not felt good. Literally, I have just been sailing along, and it is a wonderful gift. When people say that, oh, at the end, yeah, well, do I wish I hadn't received this diagnosis a year ago? Yeah, I think I'd be happy to have, if in those books they have where you choose your own ending, I'd be happy to have picked a different ending there than have that happen. But given that it has, and given that 1 year in, I am doing well and feeling great, it has been a real spiritual and emotional maturing, I'd say, and that I look at things in ways I wouldn't have if this hadn't happened, and I mean in a positive, more thoughtful, more fully awake kind of a way.
Oh my! Can I ask, because the degree to which this is a first time you've had this experience, it's only in hindsight that one can say, what was really helpful at the time of the diagnosis, or what was maybe not helpful, maybe now more in hindsight, a year down the line, that you can say some of that to us as we think of ourselves, this audience, as caregivers. Are there some things that stand out for you that you'd say were most helpful?
Well, I can say that certainly near the beginning of the diagnosis, when I said we had to you break the lid off the can, and everyone knows, Bill and I were overwhelmed with the kindness, the thoughtfulness, the generosity, and the emotional flooding of our family, of our close friends. Even those whom had been former clients of mine sent flowers and food and money, and our deep freeze was overflowing with everyone's generosity, and it was amazing. But it was, in a way, it was overwhelming. If everyone could have gotten out a schedule and spread it out, it's so lovely. And I know that's not fair, and it sounds like I'm being ungrateful, but certainly that's not the truth of it. We were very grateful, but it also came at a time when we were barely, literally, with ourselves, coping from day to day with the reality of it. So it was beautiful and amazing and difficult all at the same time, to have had all of those things in that moment. So I don't know how it could have been differently. I know that as a caregiver in the past, I've done exactly that for others. When there's a time of crisis, you share the love, and you channel your concern in a way that's practical. You make a casserole, bake a pie, take flowers. You do those things, and it was so valuable, but so hard in its own different way. One thing later on that sort of always surprises me, still catches me off guard, is when people, and even people I know quite well, are really anxious about asking me how I'm feeling, as though I've maybe forgotten that I'm sick. And that always kind of cracks me up, but that's just me and my perverse sense of humor. So I'd like to tell people, generally speaking, and maybe this is different for others. I haven't talked to a lot of people with a similar diagnosis to mine, but I'll bet that someone who has cancer didn't just forget about it. So it's probably safe to just ask them how they are without feeling self-conscious about that. So
yeah. And the fear is, of course, in asking that question is that, I mean, you assume, and this happens, of course, in grief too, I'm just taking the person back into their grief and they're actually having a really nice day. And
right.
They're not thinking
Yeah.
about it. But the reality of what you're saying is that here's the correct thing. We're always thinking about it.
You haven't forgotten, it, right? Like it's just that part of, it's
well, please don't pretend that it's not happening.
That's right.
And I really enjoy the fact that you're asking, right?
Mm-hmm. You might not be thinking about your left ear, but you haven't forgotten you have it.
Yeah. And the caring, because that's the caring you're receiving from this friend or family member, is that they've asked you how you're doing and they're showing genuine regard to know.
Yeah. And so people have been, like, generally speaking, people have been great. I think the toughest conversations, and I shared one with you yesterday, Richard, have been with my parents. But, they are struggling as well. They have a child. And while I'm an old child, I'm still their child. And I think they would prefer me to outlive them, as most of us want to be deceased before our children.
Just this helps as a way of segue to the role of the caregiver, because what you're saying and what you're pointing out is, yes, both voices exist within, whatever those voices are, the one that's, here's the difficulty I'm struggling with and so on. And here's also my living that's today. Mm-hmm. And that as a caregiver, that both those voices exist. And all counseling principle, the basis is you proceed at the pace of the individual. So wherever they are at that moment. But what you've also said is it's okay to ask, what's that realm like for you today?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And that's really quite helpful, because we're not just passive caregivers. We are actors, and it's all right to ask someone, how are you today, in the sense that it takes us into that dark realm, but it's the truth. It's the other truth, the reality that's being lived with and lived through.
Yeah. Well, we're getting the notice that we need to wrapping this up.
Okay.
So, Richard, thank you. I think you have more story to share. Maybe you'll be a guest again on the Lunch and Learn another time.
Yeah. And you too. Thank you.
And thank you for walking with me through this hour.
My privilege, Anna, very much.
Turning it over to you, Bill Harder.
So we invite your questions or comments, and